I was aware that we were doing some battles in Vietnam. I was not overly aware of what was going on. I just knew that there were advisors over there and that we were helping them battle communism. I have a brother who's 13 years older than I am who was in the Air Force at that time. He was a career non-com in the Air Force. And so as I got ready to come to the university, back when ROTC was required of every male student who didn't have a 4F deferment, I was anticipating that I would go through all 4 years of ROTC and enter the military as an Air Force officer so that I wouldn't have to be an enlisted person in the Air Force. So I came over with the intent of getting my bachelor's in music and being commissioned a second lieutenant in the Air Force. So at the time that I was interviewing to be accepted in the advanced ROTC program, I was asked if I was willing to go to Vietnam, if they would send me, and I said, yeah, if I have to, I'll go. I don't want to, but I'll go if I have to. And so I was aware that it was going on. I had a number of friends in the university that were protesting the war. And I was in ROTC, and so we would have some long discussions. Because they were friends, I did not put down their position, and because we were friends, they didn't put down my position. We would talk about things. And as I talked with them and bounced that off of the things that were important to me in my religion, I began to question our policies in Vietnam. The topics of discussion had to do basically with killing. That what we were doing in Vietnam was we were killing people who were just trying to defend their homeland. And I was saying that we were engaged in military action to prevent the spread of communism, which was atheistic, and we didn't want to see the spread of atheistic communism. And so we would debate back and forth around those. I began to become uncomfortable with the whole idea that we were killing people in order to stop the spread of atheism. It didn't match up with my understanding of Jesus telling us that we were supposed to love one another. I don't see how you can love someone and kill them at the same time. That was the beginning of my change from being basically pro-military to becoming anti-war. Now, it's important to make it clear that I became anti-war. I did not become anti-military. Like I say, I have a brother who was a career non-com in the Air Force. I had made a number of friends in the ROTC program while I was in college, and they were still friends and still are friends. But I was beginning to question the military approach to the prevention of communism, and I was also beginning to question the whole idea that a communist nation in Vietnam was a threat to the United States. That didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Why the spread of communism there, especially since most of the people in the whole nation, the two Vietnams, seemed to prefer it, why that was a threat to the United States. That didn't make a lot of sense to me, and I began to question that. And then I began to get into difficulties with my ROTC professors because they didn't like me questioning that. And at one point, I very clearly remember sitting in an air science class, and one of the professors, he was a captain, I think, at the time, made the comment that the purpose of the military is to kill people. And I stopped and thought about that, decided that he was right, and that I didn't want to kill people, so maybe I didn't belong in the military. And as time went on, I became more and more convinced of the fact that I didn't belong in the military because I didn't want to kill people and I didn't want to support those who were killing people at the time. And that began to turn me against the war in Vietnam very strongly.
So you were there during the height of the war.
Right.
What was it like on campus in 65, 66, 67?
It was fairly quiet because there was a strong but very small anti-war contingent at that time. We were slow. The Montana being as small as it is, it tends to be a few years behind some of the trends. So we were just starting to get an strong anti-war movement on the campus. It was still very small, but it was very strong. And as each year went by, it got stronger and larger. And by the time I was a senior and had dropped out of ROTC, with the mutual agreement of the Air Force, it was like the Air Force and I came to an agreement that I didn't belong there. By the time I was a senior, the anti-war movement on campus was going pretty strongly. It was still a minority. Most of the students were either didn't care or were pro the war, but there was a very strong contingent of anti-war students at the time that I graduated. It was coming up. Back then, the peace symbol was often referred to around Missoula as the footprint of the great American chicken. The people didn't realize the amount of courage that it took to stand up and say, no, wait a minute, I'm against this. And so a lot of the fraternity guys thought we were yellow and cowards and just didn't want to take the risk, instead of understanding that we were taking a pretty big risk in saying, we disagree.
So the debate that was going on nationally was also going on right here in town.
It was, yeah.
Do you remember any specific events on campus? Were there any demonstrations or sit-ins or anything that come to mind?
There was, all the way through, there was a weekly demonstration of silence in front of what's now the Lomason Center. That was the Student Union building back then. It was before the UC was built. And every week, during the lunch hour, as I recall, there would be a group of students that would simply stand in silent protest to the war for an hour. And many of them were my friends, and when I was in ROTC, I would stop and argue with them, and then later I found myself standing with them.
What year did you start standing with them?
And it would have been pretty much my senior year, 67, 68, yeah.
Was there anything, was there any particular day in Vietnam that seemed to really solidify your changing opinion?
No. My opinion really began to change when I got back to Boston to go to seminary. That's when things really started solidifying. I went back to Boston in September of 1968, and within a couple of weeks, there was an Army private and I think a Marine private who came to members of the School of Theology and requested sanctuary in the chapel at Boston University. And so the theology students arranged for sanctuary, and we took these two students in and kept them in the chapel for several weeks. They had both been told they were going to Vietnam, and neither one of them wanted to go to Vietnam. And they were attempting to either get the military to discharge them or at least agree not to send them to Vietnam. So they were absent without leave, and the military police and the FBI and all kinds of various authorities were keeping an eye on what was going on, and the students made a big publicity thing out of it. It was in Boston Magazine. It was a big national affair, and I got caught up in that, and the more I got caught up in it, the stronger my beliefs that the war in Vietnam was wrong, the stronger they became. I ended up leading a lot of singing during that 2-week-long protest. We would gather in the chapel and we'd sing songs and we would have speeches and we'd argue over policy and so on. The Students for Democratic Society tried to take over the protest. The School of Theology students had to stand strong to see to it that they didn't take over. We wanted to make sure that it was done with respect and with dignity, and that it didn't turn into some kind of circus. It got kind of circusy anyway. And then one morning at 5 o'clock, the FBI and I think some of the military police from the Army broke into the chapel and started looking for the one guy who was still there. The Marine had turned himself in, and I have no idea what happened to him. But they came barreling in. We tried to tell them where the guy was. They wouldn't believe us. They knocked down 4 or 5 doors with axes, just splintered them, looking for this guy before they finally went where we told him that he was. And then they dragged him out of Marsh Chapel, and of course the Boston Globe and the Herald and all of those were busy taking pictures and everything else as they dragged him off and hauled him off to whatever army base, and where he was convicted of being absent without leave. They were threatening to charge him with desertion, but they couldn't quite get away with it because they always knew where he was. And that whole experience really was culminated by the way they broke into the chapel and tore it to shreds to get this guy out, when we were working very hard at being nonviolent and going to cooperate with them when they came in, but we wanted to make our statement. So that was the time that really solidified me as being very strongly anti-war, and I'm still anti-war.
So did you carry that with you through the duration of the war?
Yes.
Into the early 70s. So what did you do after that? Kind of flash forward to modern times here.
Well, I graduated from seminary in 1972 and came back out west to serve as a local church pastor. And during the time that I was a local church pastor, I simply quietly talked with people one-on-one about the inaccuracies, I guess is the right word, of the war. The fact that we were being told one thing and we were doing another. We were being told we were trying to save South Vietnam, and yet we were destroying villages. The whole idea of we had to destroy the village to save it just that was such a concept that was so alien to the whole idea of loving your neighbor, let alone loving your enemy, that it really made it difficult for me. So I didn't, as a local pastor, I was not involved in big demonstrations. I worked quietly with people out of respect for their ideas, their opinions. That was always part of my role while I was in seminary. Backtracking just a little bit. While I was in seminary, there were, in addition to the anti-war movement in seminary, there were also men there that were studying to be with the intent of becoming chaplains in the military. And sometimes those people who were going to become chaplains in the military and the people who were strongly anti-war would be unable to communicate with each other. Because I'd been in ROTC but now was anti-war, I kind of ended up being the go-between because I could talk to both sides. And being respectful of where someone is has always been a major issue for me. So while I was and still am anti-war, I never have been and still am not anti-military people. People need to be where they are. And they have their reasons for being there. And I try to listen respectfully and then hope that they will listen respectfully to me. But as a pastor of a local church, I was never involved in any major anti-war movements or anything because I felt that it would be disrespectful of the people in my church who didn't agree with that. But I would talk with them and we would dialogue and so on. And then this was well after Vietnam. I was in Great Falls and I had a number of military personnel in my church. And we would dialogue about what it meant to be in the military and still be a Christian. And I would say that the main reason I'm anti-war is because of my faith. That Jesus taught us to love one another and care for one another, and I don't see how you can do that while you're shooting at somebody.
And you still hold that belief?
I still hold that belief.
Gulf, Iraq War.
Right. Yeah.
Is it the conversation that reoccurs during each conflict?
Yes. Yes. Every time we find ourselves in another military action, I'm asking myself and I'm asking the people in government and I'm asking my friends, why do we have to kill people in order to maintain a Christian lifestyle? It doesn't fit. There's something wrong with it. And it's often a matter of when a person thinks force becomes necessary. And in the Christian tradition, St. Augustine held forth a just war theory and said that there are times when war is the best alternative. And while that makes a certain amount of sense, and if there's been a just war, World War II might be it. As a student of history, a very minor student of history, I would agree that we probably needed to fight World War II, but there were many things we did while we fought World War II that were immoral, that were war crimes, that we should not be proud of in any way, shape, or form, and we should learn not to do those kinds of things again. when our nation is under threat, it's a little harder to make an anti-war position. So after 9/11, being anti-war was difficult, but the way we went about it, both militarily and politically, made it easy to be anti-war because we were bombing villages of people and not going after the combatants. And the way things are still going on, now we have this question of ISIS. How do you negotiate with somebody who won't negotiate? I don't know, but we need to try. Do we need a strong military to make it possible for us to negotiate? Probably, but how strong is always an issue to be dealt with. There are some people who use the slogan, "I'm already against the next war." And I would say I'm already 90% against the next war. But at the same time, I'm not totally anti having a military force to help keep those people who would go absolutely berserk under control. It's like having a police force. And the question comes, is America's military the police force of the world? And I think that's a very legitimate question for debate.
What do you think of Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda?
Yeah. How do we police those kinds of people, and what does it mean when the police force or the military force engages in the same kind of behavior as the bad guys? And we're having somewhat that same question right now with all of the shootings of police and shootings of unarmed people of color in the United States right now. What happens when the police force uses the same tactics as the bad guys?
What do you think is the greatest misunderstanding about the peace movement and people who demonstrate against military action?
That we're unpatriotic, that we don't really love our country. One of the things that bugged me back during the war in Vietnam, and it still bugs me, is that the flag, the American flag, has virtually become synonymous with support of military action. When the war in Vietnam was going on, we had people saying, "America, love it or leave it." Well, the problem was that those of us who were opposed to the war in Vietnam love America. And so we didn't need to leave it because we love the country. We just disagreed with that policy. And we disagreed with the idea that the use of military force is a convenient extension of diplomatic policy. It should be a last resort, not a convenient tool. And one of the great advantages that we have now is people who go into the military more or less because they want to. When I was in college, a lot of people went into the war in Vietnam because they were told to. The draft was pretty bad. But it's interesting to me that during the war in Vietnam, people would join the National Guard so that they wouldn't be drafted and sent to Vietnam. Now, you join the National Guard and you will probably be deployed in a war zone. But at least you know that going in. And if you choose not to participate in that, you don't have to.
So it sounds like events during the war, your days in college at the university, and your change of philosophy or perspective, it had a lasting effect on,
yes.
on you. Maybe just summarize with that.
Yeah, it did. Yeah, I am still opposed to using military force as a convenient tool. But I'm not opposed to people who happen to serve in the military.